The Opening of the Way, a practical guide to the wisdom teachings of ancient Egypt. Introduction. Modern man is the product of several centuries of cerebral culture. He has taught himself so much that he imagines he can progress unaided, simply regarding evolution as the logical development and mutual adaptation of cells, organs, and faculties. This state of mind professes to explain the universe and man by reason and reason only, without supposing there to be any creative cause. It has, of course, strengthened the notion of free will, for if man has no other cause to consider beyond himself, if he is supreme in nature and the rational faculty supreme in man, then obviously he cannot admit the existence of any natural laws or forces other than those which his reasoning faculty can analyze. And this faculty seems to him to exist as a logical means of subjecting natural forces to his control. Research into human nature has therefore taken a biological, chemical, and largely mechanistic direction, with a purely analytical and Cartesian view of science, and has come up with no constructive answers to the question of how life ought to be lived. But science, oriented thus to the increase of material comfort, has created new needs, and these in turn have developed in man a keen sense of envy and a terrible sense of haste. The envy has become a social malady, and the sense of haste is so tyrannical that much thought is spent on trying to satisfy the need for it. Hence the feverish search for anything which will indulge the senses and the emotions, until in the end an emotional stimulus is valued only for its violence, but whether the effect of its indulgence is good or harmful, nobody knows or cares. The life of the senses, when indulged so far, becomes extremely exacting. It is simple enough to arouse one's physical appetites, but not so easy to control them. Nerves trained to excitement feel an unhealthy craving for it, and when the life of brain and senses has been accustomed to be fed continually from without by an unending flow of second-hand thoughts and images, of catchy tunes and twitching rhythms, it calls for these things because they render individual effort superfluous and shake to pieces any notion of real values. That is our modern world, dancing the infernal roundelay of haste, ever more deeply involved in the quest for variety and novelty. A mind trained to these frantic gymnastics will clearly show two characteristics. It will be insatiable, always preferring quantity to quality, and it will suffer from the need for speed. The quantitative mentality has done much already to transform the social pattern, producing a loss of interest in quality, and the need for speed has been transforming the lives of all humanity by abolishing distance, bringing nations and races dangerously close together without giving them any principle of concord. But the worst effect of all these new impulses has been the nervous imbalance which cannot tolerate silence or inactivity. These two pillars of meditation, without which one can have no true intuition or spiritual experience. It may be objected that many inspirations, inventions, and even spiritual conversions have happened suddenly, without any preceding meditation. But the objection is unfounded because, however sudden a flash of intuition, it can only be perceived by one in a receptive state, that is, one capable of catching the moment of inspiration and allowing it to gestate in attentive silence. It is not difficult to show that this condition of readiness, which is stillness of the nerves and brain and heart, is hardly compatible with an impatient appetite which in modern man is exaggerated into an imperious need of the nerves and senses. For a need demands satisfaction, and the effort to satisfy it has disoriented our moral sense and our whole consciousness. On the deepest level, consciousness is the perception by our inner being of all the experiences that come to us. Physical consciousness can be involuntary, as when a burn produces in some part of the body a sudden awareness and shrinking from the fire. But our cerebral consciousness is always the servant of our various appetites. The most common illustration is when heart and head agree to oblige each other by both obeying the appetites. They find excuses for one another, and between them create a pattern of consciousness, whose secret origin one professes to be ignorant of. This disorientation of consciousness has led us to the denial of three essential qualities. First, we deny the constant intervention of the creative word, inasmuch as the modern mind discovers as much first cause as it requires in the activity of our cells, their faculties, and their logical progress toward mutual adaptation. Second, spiritual inspiration and animation are denied, inasmuch as the acceptance of this idea would reduce the scope of pure reason and deprive it of the virtue of being self-created. Third, there is denial of the harmonious relationship of all parts of our universe. For the understanding of this is not to be reached by intellectual search alone, but only by the path of silence and true meditation. Yet, thanks to our greater ease of contact with other cultures, we now have many records of the direct perception of abstract realities or of psychic influence exerted on living beings and natural objects. Europeans, when they witness such phenomena among peoples whom they call barbaric or backward, are surprised to find that there exists a traditional metaphysical background that is handed down by initiation. And though the methods of applying this knowledge are different in every tribe and culture, the essential condition is everywhere the same, namely, the communion of the initiates with the great spiritual principle whose name alone is different depending on religion or doctrine. The development of man's mental faculties is the characteristic task of the West, but it has been misdirected, making a means into an end, and the intensive development of these faculties in the latest stage of our evolution has given us nowadays a distorted notion of the extent of our human powers. Rational information has usurped the throne of knowledge and has declared valueless the heritage of ancient wisdom, which might cause it to lose its throne. The learned rationalist wants above all things to avoid encountering where doubt and knowledge meet, the one power which could limit his own, a divine power which he could neither analyze nor check. And our learned man is in some danger of meeting this divine power, the spirit, as he might properly call it, within himself. For that which incarnated at his birth received the impression of a spiritual impulse, which has a universal significance, though coloured by his individual nature. Had his understanding been aroused so as to develop this first spiritual impulse, he would have been able to prevent his analytical reasoning faculty from acting like an angel of death, to prevent the birth of his divine self from the depths of the primal paradise. That this is possible has been proved by the appearance at various crises in human history of a sage who, by not permitting his rational judgment to interfere, was able to remain in contact with the creative word he was to express, and thus reveal to the world some spark of the divine wisdom. If they are disposed to receive it, this spark of truth does give a moment of inspiration to those it touches, but they must then go through the same experience as happens after birth. If the spark is received and brooded over by the immortal being incarnate in the body, then it causes him to grow and increase his power. But if it is only received by the faculty of rational judgment, then the intellect will seize upon it and alter it to its own advantage, according to its preconceptions. And this intellect, acting as usual like an angel of separation, arranges its arbitrary code of good and evil so as to further its own control. This interference by the reasoning faculty results in sterility. Total awareness can no longer develop. Like a piece of earth deprived of its natural fertilizers, the rationalist receives no other nourishment than the arguments handed out by his intellect, and the latter develops only slowly, being influenced by nothing but the painful stresses and accidents of normal life. One might suppose that this consequence would have put men on their guard and induced them to seek a remedy, but not at all. Lucifer is an angel of light, and his appearance will always deceive the worldly. Moreover, the serpent which sowed discord between Adam and Eve is the very incarnation of that greed which creates in man the hunger for quantity, and then, to satisfy that, the infernal thirst for activity. And if anyone, be he Buddha, Christ, or sage, dares to denounce this error, he is at once suspected of an assault on the happiness of the human race, that is, on its freedom to perpetuate its slavery on earth. Toward the one truth, modern inventions have brought East and West closer together, and given us back some contact with the sages of old time. Many sacred texts have been translated into European languages. Their inner meaning, of course, has not been revealed, for that requires a perfect knowledge not only of the language and letters, but also of the symbolism. Yet enough light has been shed from the ancient wisdom to arouse interest among modern people. The architecture of Egypt and of the East bears witness to undeniable achievements in geometry, mathematics, and cosmogony. Of those civilizations, the most ancient and long-lived seems to have been the period of the pharaohs, for the most ancient Greek and Chinese cultures were followed by geological cataclysms and floods, and have left no remains. About 3000 BC, the pyramid texts were already speaking with authority of the constitution of man, his survival of death, and his relation to the life of the cosmos. Much later, Moses, who was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, Acts 7 verse 22, included in the Pentateuch as much of it as was suitable for his people, and out of this tradition came Christianity. In the meanwhile, Lao Tse had illuminated the path of pure wisdom with the essential precepts of the Tao, and the Buddha had given to his disciples the law and the example of non-violence and compassion. During these millennia, the dynasties of pharaohs had developed in symbolic terms the evolution of the royal principle, that is, of superhumanity, in the individual. Of this, the pharaoh himself was the prototype, first in his Osirian development, then in his further evolution as Horus. And this evolution was also related to astronomical periods. Until the coming of the Christ, the Egyptian sages brought to perfection their teaching in written texts and on their monuments, and ultimately they recapitulated in the Ptolemaic temple of Philae the whole symbolism of Isis and Osiris in relation to man and nature, and also that of Horus, which had hitherto been reserved for the initiates of the temple and now became the very foundation of the mission of Christ. After this, the initiations of the Essenes were the link between the wisdom of Egypt, the metaphysic of St. John, the pure mysticism of the first 3 centuries of the Christian Church in Asia Minor, Africa and Europe, and finally the philosophical symbolism of the Byzantines. In the 4th century began the assertion of the temporal power of the Church and its political activity with the interminable disputes of theologians and synods. The schism of 1054 between Byzantium and Rome did not prevent the Crusaders from bringing back to Europe the knowledge of Byzantine symbolism, which is the basis of that of our great cathedrals. Thus, in spite of theological differences, the Coptic and Abyssinian churches, who were the first Christians in Africa, as well as the Orthodox and Roman churches, were all united by the symbolism they had received from Egypt, and which had been handed down in sculpture and architecture, in liturgy and ritual. This unity of tradition, showing them all to be founded on the same original understanding, was the best evidence of their essential soundness. It is regrettable that a strict dictatorship, inspired by the wish for temporal power, should have used the threat of excommunication to put practical and sometimes even indefensible commandments on the same footing as indisputable dogmas. The consequences were the Lutheran and Calvinist schisms, and the violent reaction of Catholicism, for all its bloodshed, neither prevented the success of Protestantism nor corrected its own abuses. The cause of Catholicism was more hindered than helped both by the martyrdom of the Templar sages and by the torture inflicted by the Inquisition on men who practiced an individual quest for knowledge. Yet this does not entitle us to attack the Christian message which came to the world at the date required by cosmic harmony, and gave humanity proof that union is possible between the divine and the human. For all the great traditions have spoken of man on earth as in a transitory condition between his original state of non-separation and his final conscious return to union with the divine. The trouble came from man's desire to possess, wield, and know by means of his brain and senses all the powers that he knew in himself before being separated from it. This is why the Gospel declares that to enter the kingdom of heaven one must become as a little child. That is, must let the mind obey the impulses which come from the heart and spirit. All the great messengers of the Spirit and the masters of mysticism have declared with one voice that the supreme aim of humanity is reunion with its divine principle. As means to this end, they all mention simplicity of heart and mind and the abolition of hatred, violence, and vengeance, even when these are given the pretext of rectifying the human conscience. These teachers have never been guilty of theological quarreling or theocratic dictatorship, nor can their teaching be impugned by those who have. But to attack the latter and expose the reasons for their fanaticism would only be another mistake and would give rise to futile acrimony. Attack implies a wish to be right and to overcome an adversary. Where worldly expediency is the object, it can be effective, but in the spread of the enlightenment of the human consciousness, it can only hinder because its arbitrary interference prevents errors from proving themselves to be so. Lao Tse defines wisdom as complete willingness to be the plaything of chance circumstances. This, says he, is why the sage is able to accomplish the great designs of non-activity. And these great designs of non-activity are the will of our Father in heaven, whose will must be done on earth as in heaven. The teaching is the same in both cases, and both teachers insist on simplicity of heart and mind. Unless ye become as little children, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven, said the Christ. Lao Tse said, the mind of the man of established virtue may be compared to that of a newborn child. He does not seem to suspect that poisonous insects bite or sting, that the claws of wild beasts can rend and the talons of birds of prey can tear. Such men can express luminous truths in the most ordinary language. The Buddha likewise preached the abolition of hatred and discord and rejected complexity of doctrine. He made true understanding consist in the direct vision of that which cannot be put in writing and in the communion of the Spirit. The Christ said, Woe unto you, lawyers, for ye have taken away the key of knowledge. Ye entered not in yourselves, and them that were entering in ye hindered. Luke 11, verse 52. And although Jesus was born of Israel, and came to fulfill the law and the prophets, it was to a Samaritan woman and enemy of the Jews that he taught the only true way of worship. Woman, believe me, the hour cometh, when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. John 4, verse 21. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. John 4, verse 23 and 24. This saying no other wisdom can contradict, because being universal, it brings peace to all those who are seeking in spirit and in truth. Every sincere seeker has in his heart this will toward the light, and if he listens to it, he will not seek in vain. For he will know that behind all religions there is only one truth, and the revelation of this truth through their different myths and symbols brings harmony instead of discord. This clarification will only be resisted by those who want to obscure the original teaching in order to assure their own control over the minds and consciences of men. The difficulty of the present age is caused by the confused variety of beliefs and opinions. The restlessness of our daily life and the falsity of conventional artificial standards in morality and aesthetics have corrupted our vision until it seems that nothing short of catastrophe can arouse us to a truer awareness. We confuse the discernment of reality with our personal opinion, and intellectual judgment with recognition of truth. The recognition of truth means discerning true form false and pure from impure, and must always be related to our aim in making such a distinction. Should our aim be to reject the impure altogether, or to discern how much of it can be transmuted into the pure? If the latter, whoever is to decide must have in his nature something of the impure as well as the pure. To take an example, the lead which is used for purifying gold is carried off with the impurities, while the gold remains. And so the utilitarian mind would say that in this operation the gold is the true judge of purity. The wisdom of the Egyptians, however, thought otherwise, for the name of judge was given to the imperfect thing which avails to separate pure and impure. This imperfect thing is human nature, and the physical body is the vehicle of the consciousness built up by the experiences of life. But if this consciousness is to mediate and discern effectively, it must be free to undergo its experiences uncorrupted by artificial notions and conventional rules. Otherwise, the imperfect thing will reject the pure instead of being transmuted by it. The pure is the immortal element in man, his divine soul or, in Egyptian terms, his higher ka. It is the Christ-like or Horus-like element which, by its union with the corporeal man, makes the latter a complete consciousness and teaches him to distinguish real values from relative values. This notion fills our mortal personality with dread, and it fights to the last ditch. That is why the cornerstone, the Christ manifested, will always be a stumbling block to the human intellect, for reality must always appear as a judgment upon the error which refuses to acknowledge it. Because our values have been corrupted, our mortal world is enveloped in a gathering storm. There must obviously occur in life on earth crises from time to time, when all those elements of human nature which can possibly seem to possess free will burst like prisoners from a jail and all violently attack one another with mutual hatred, each blaming the other for the tumult which none of them understand. At such a time the voice of a sage will not be heard, the fury must first abate, But if after the tempest we hope for calm to be restored, we must acknowledge that serenity can only be established by wisdom founded upon true understanding. And this wisdom has never been denied to humanity, although it has only been made manifest at the appropriate time and place. Spirit, being universal, has never revealed itself through one exclusive interpreter. All races and all epochs have produced their great ones who have shown what wisdom and power can be attained by the man who knows how to cultivate in himself those sacred gifts. Yet just as a crystal cannot form except in a solution of its proper nature, but will then form other similar crystals around itself, so the world cannot be enlightened by the incarnation of a single elect spirit. For this world will not be transformed unless there are present other elements able to receive the message and bring it to fruition. These elements will never be more than a minority, an elite group. Consciousness, in the mass of humanity, is still too vague for the experience of an individual spiritual calling, and these elements will therefore always remain in flocks and herds, prudently on the lookout. But any man who does not wish to be carried away by the tempestuous instability of the mass should have the courage nowadays to seek the light for himself, freely and without restraint. For today is a new phase of development, and there is already a gulf between yesterday and today. The disturbances of our chaotic age have at least had the advantage that they have overthrown the barriers and shaken the values which society dared to alter. Instead of waiting for this old construction to collapse upon our heads, we should be wise to dig down quickly and find the indestructible foundations of the ancient wisdom. The aim of this work is to aid in this rediscovery. Chapter 1. Freedom of Individual Search. Have we the right to claim the freedom of individual search? It would be unwise to give too absolute an answer, for the answer must depend on the stage of evolution of the individual's consciousness, on his convictions, and often on his courage. One should never try to force understanding on those who cannot or will not listen. Equally, the flesh of a fruit must be distinguished from its kernel, and the mass of humanity from the elite who can become its growing point. The latter are the chosen, in that they are prepared to develop themselves to the suprahuman state. They are called to the reconstruction of the conscious cosmic man, each one being a cell of his body, a number entity. Among the chosen there are two categories. First are those who are no longer entirely satisfied by the explanations of Western dogma, and yet are still deeply attached to certain religious observances. These should never be urged to abandon the practice of their cult, for ritual and communal prayer are a strong moral support, and without them the liberated man is in some danger of confusing freedom of experience with mere absence of morality. Second, there are those who feel an imperious need to seek the light outside of dogmatic prohibitions and ritual obligations. These should be told the truth that Buddhist mystics teach their disciples. Hitherto you needed ritual, cults, and images to comfort you in your earthly life, to channel your passions and direct your mind toward a higher world. But if you wish to find deliverance and create in yourself the conditions of eternal life, you should give up doctrinal obligations whenever they interfere with the freedom of your quest. The Christ also had an answer for such seekers when he said that God must be worshipped in spirit and in truth. However, we need to know what is meant by in spirit and in truth. Buddhism teaches very rightly that ignorance is an obstacle to deliverance, and ignorance includes wrong beliefs which prevent individual experience by means of rigid doctrines or intellectual and moral restrictions. Nothing encourages selfish amorality more than the excuse of blind belief and the certainty of pardon, especially when one need not even sincerely fulfill the conditions for obtaining the pardon. The ideas of fault, sin, condemnation, and pardon have only a very relative value unless we look at the reality behind them. Faults committed against an established convention are a matter for the community or the social order. But as regards real sins, what man can judge the sins of another, not being able to read his conscience and see his real motives? The evil which makes a man a sinner in reality resides not in the act itself, but in offending against one's own conviction. And this remains true, whether or not the conviction is justified. For the conviction, unless it be an artificial intellectual construction, is the product of the present consciousness of the individual, and in obeying it he is obeying what is truth for him at present, and even if the result is unfortunate, he will remain essentially innocent, though he had to abide the temporal consequences. In other words, the experience will enlarge his consciousness without retarding its final unification. If, on the other hand, his conviction is based on rational arguments, the unfortunate consequences of error can enlighten his consciousness if he understands them. If not, a dimming of consciousness will result until he learns how to eliminate rationalizations from his judgments. The lack of convictions, that is, of vigilant consciousness, is a state not of innocence, but a state of stupidity in which a man loses both his sense of responsibility and his feeling for human experience. Equally, blind submission to denominational authority is an excuse for killing the sense of responsibility and prevents the growth of discernment. For one only learns by what one suffers in one's own person and experiences within oneself, and the only help that can be given is advice regarding the correctness of the aim and the efficacy of the means. No one can be transformed by the experience of another. He who would realize his suprahuman unity must leave the herd and set out along to explore his own self, and through himself the universe.